That day I came into your life very gently, like the way an afternoon passes, when people are still watching the crowds flow back and forth, without realizing that the sunset has already faded. Everything began so naturally that, if someone were to ask me, when did you start loving him? I don't think I could ever give a complete answer, because that feeling didn't begin with a moment clear enough to be named. There was no love at first sight, no special day worth marking on a calendar, just ordinary afternoons following one another, conversations without beginnings or endings, and your presence slowly becoming something familiar in my everyday life. It was the way we would sit beside each other, a little longer than planned, the way you leaned slightly toward me when you spoke, your voice dropping just a little, as if afraid of breaking the quiet between us, the way your eyes rested on me for a few seconds longer, long enough to make my heart miss a beat, and short enough for me to turn away in time, pretending I was lost in thought. I was afraid you might notice that I had started paying attention to you more than I should. I don't remember exactly when. I grew accustomed to your presence in my days. I only know that on days we didn't meet, something felt missing, like leaving the house without my keys. Not a panic, just a quiet uneasiness that lingered all day. A feeling that something that should have been there wasn't. That feeling followed me from morning to night, leaving me with the sense that I was waiting for something, even though I didn't know what it was. You were never someone who talked much. Your words were always brief, sometimes almost abrupt, yet somehow just enough for me to understand what you were thinking. I liked the way you stayed silent when listening, never interrupting, never rushing to give an opinion. I even liked the moments when you didn't know what to say and simply smiled, as if that smile could replace every long explanation. Being with you, I never felt the need to become someone else. I could stay quiet. I could talk about the smallest, most trivial things without fear of being judged. One day, I placed a glass of iced tea already diluted in front of you by mistake. By the time I noticed, it was too late. The ice had nearly melted. I panicked and apologized, reaching to replace it, afraid you wouldn't like it. But you only shook your head gently, smiled faintly, and drank it anyway, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was such a tiny moment. No one around us noticed, yet it stayed with me for a long time, because when you love someone, sometimes all it takes is their quiet acceptance of one small imperfection of yours to soften your entire heart without a single word. Every night before sleeping, my phone would light up once, only once, not a long message, just a familiar question. Did you get home safely? Nothing more, no lengthy concern. And yet, I always replied immediately, so quickly that even I was surprised, as if being a moment late might cause that care to disappear, fragile, existing only for an instant. We loved each other in a very grown-up way. We never asked what the future would be like. We never painted distant dreams. You never promised to hold my hand to the end of the road, and I never dared to ask you to. All I needed was to wake up each morning with you as my first thought, and to know that, in some small moment of your day, I also crossed your mind. That alone was enough to make me feel at ease, enough to believe that I was exactly where I belonged. There were days when the rain fell softly, not loud or heavy, just enough to slow the city down. Familiar streets grew quieter than usual. We stood together beneath an old awning, time moving more slowly than it should. The space between us was so close. I could hear your breathing. Our shoulders touched. I didn't dare move, afraid that even the smallest motion would shatter the moment. You were silent, and I found myself wishing that the rain would last just a little longer, so we wouldn't have to step away from that peaceful shelter, so everything could stay frozen. Right there. Evenings passed gently. We sat side by side, each doing our own thing. You read. I scrolled through my phone. No need for many words, just knowing that someone was there, close enough to keep loneliness away. Sometimes you would ask quietly if I was tired, if I was eating well. Such ordinary questions. Questions that, looking back now, I realize meant more to me than I ever understood at the time. Because in those simple words, I felt cared for in the softest way. I once believed that happiness could be that simple. It didn't have to be dazzling. It didn't need admiration from anyone. Just warm enough to make you want to return after a long, exhausting day. In those days, I loved you with all the innocence I had, without calculation, without fear of loss, without thoughts of leaving. I trusted what we had. I trusted that sense of calm. And I believed that, as long as we were still beside each other, everything would be all right. Back then, I truly believed that, as long as things stayed this peaceful, I could love you for a very long time. And then there were days when I began to realize that things were no longer the same. Not because you had changed in any obvious way. Not because something big had happened. Nothing clear enough to be named. Just very small things. So small that, if you weren't paying attention, you could easily let them pass. You started replying to my messages a little more slowly. Not so slow that you disappeared entirely. Just not as fast as before. Sometimes I would send a very short message and wait a long time, only to receive a single okay or a brief reply that left no room for the conversation to continue. I would stare at my phone, reading that reply over and over, wondering whether I should send something else or whether I should stop there. Your words grew shorter too. You asked less. You told me less about your day. The little things you used to share, things that once seemed insignificant, no longer appeared in our conversations. I didn't dare ask why. I just quietly remembered that perhaps I was no longer the person. You wanted to tell everything too, and your eyes, the eyes that once lingered on me, now passed over me more quickly. Not long enough for me to feel noticed. Not deep enough for me to believe that I was still important to you. There were moments when I was talking, and you were listening, nodding, responding. Yet I could tell your mind was somewhere far away. We still walked side by side, the same old streets, the same familiar cafes, the corners of the city that once made me feel at home. But your hand no longer reached for mine on its own. The distance between us wasn't far, but it wasn't close either. A distance just right to make someone feel unsteady. Sometimes I wanted to take your hand first, to step forward just a little, to see whether, if I reached out, you would reach back. But then I stopped, because I was afraid that if I were the only one moving forward, while you stayed still, the distance between us would become painfully clear. Afraid of the feeling of holding my hand out and not having it taken. Our dates grew quieter, not the comfortable silence from before, when simply sitting together felt enough, but a silence that made me think constantly about what I should say, when I should smile, how to steer the conversation so the air between us wouldn't grow heavier. Sometimes I would say something very softly, just to break the silence, and you would respond with a quiet The conversation would fall back into emptiness. And I realized then, it wasn't that I had nothing to say. It was that you no longer wanted to listen the way you once did. I had so many questions I wanted to ask you. I wanted to know you were thinking. I wanted to know whether I had done something wrong. I wanted to know if you still felt comfortable being with me. But every time I was about to speak, I stopped because I was afraid the answer would be something I wasn't strong enough to face. Afraid that the moment I asked, there would be no way back for us. So I chose silence. I chose to stay. And slowly, I began to love you a little more than the version of myself from before. I cared a little more, missed you a little more, noticed every small change in your routines. I paid attention to whether you were tired, whether you were eating properly, whether something was troubling you that you couldn't say out loud. I learned to listen more, ask less, and accept more. I hoped that if I tried just a little harder, if I became just a little gentler, everything would return to how it was in the beginning. I believed that love could be compensated for with patience, that if I stayed long enough, you would notice. And you were never a bad person. You were still gentle, still caring in your own way. You still remembered the things that mattered, still asked when it felt necessary. It was just that your feelings no longer carried the same eagerness, no more anticipation, no more desire to move toward me. You were still there, but you were no longer staying with your whole heart. Your presence felt more like a habit than a choice, and I kept convincing myself that, as long as you were still here, nothing was truly over yet. There were nights when I stared at my phone for a long time, waiting for a late message, waiting for a familiar question, waiting for anything that could prove I still mattered. And when nothing came, I told myself that you were probably just busy, that I was overthinking. I learned to understand you more, while asking myself less and less whether I was okay. I grew used to swallowing my emotions, used to soothing myself, used to loving in silence. I didn't dare blame you, because loving less is not a fault. No one can force another person to love forever the way they did at the beginning. It's just that when one person steps back, the other will unconsciously step forward. And when only one person walks, the road becomes unbearably long without realizing it. The distance between two hearts began to fall out of sync. No noise, no collapse, just a little farther apart each day. So far that sometimes, even when I was standing right next to you, I felt as though I were already very far away. It turns out, the most painful thing isn't the breakup. It isn't the moment when the word end is finally spoken. It isn't the moment of turning away and walking off. It's when I'm still beside you, still walking next to you every day, still calling your name in the most ordinary conversations. Yet deep inside, I know very clearly I'm the one who loves more. I didn't realize it through anything dramatic, just very small things. So small that if you're not paying attention, you can easily convince yourself that everything is still fine. It's the way you talk about your future in such a calm, neutral tone. You speak about your work, about upcoming plans, about long-term goals. And in all of it, I no longer mention the way I used to be. It's not that you're deliberately leaving me out. It's just that I'm no longer the first thing that comes to your mind. I still sit there listening, still nod, still smile at the right moments, still ask questions carefully, afraid that if I ask too much, I'll become unnecessary, in my own place within your story. But something inside me is quietly breaking. No noise, no one hears it, just tiny pieces, falling one by one, and I have to gather them together so I don't look too hurt. I begin to understand that in a relationship, it isn't always two people loving each other equally. Sometimes only one person is loving, while the other stays, out of habit. Someone who loves alone, within a relationship, doesn't dare to ask for more, doesn't dare to ask why messages come less often, doesn't dare to ask why eyes have changed, doesn't dare to ask whether they still matter. They don't blame, they don't resent, because deep down, they understand that loving less isn't a fault. It's simply something no one wants. Yet it still happens. So the one who loves alone stays a little longer, stays with their gentleness, stays by yielding again and again, stays by lowering their expectations, loving with whatever feelings remain, loving while constantly reminding themselves not to hope for too much. There are days when I feel like I'm living in two different worlds. On the outside, I'm still the one beside you, still smiling, still talking, still appearing calm. But on the inside, I'm the one constantly holding myself together, holding back sadness, holding back disappointment, holding back the feeling that I'm slowly becoming replaceable. There are very late nights when every sound has faded into silence. I lie staring at the dark ceiling, my phone beside me, lighting up and going dark again. I want to message you so many things. I want to ask you whether you still love me the way you used to. But then I stop because I'm afraid the answer would leave me without the courage to stay, yet still not strong enough to leave. And then, on one of those very late nights, I finally understand. I understand with a clarity that I can no longer ignore, that I'm no longer waiting for anything. I don't stay because I still have hope. I stay because I don't yet have the courage to leave. I'm not brave enough to admit that I loved someone who no longer chose me. I don't blame you because you never promised to love me forever. And I don't blame myself either, because loving wholeheartedly has never been a mistake. It's just that when two hearts are no longer in sync, one person will have to hurt more. And that person is usually the one who stays the longest. Our love ends in silence. No clear goodbye, no arguments, no loud tears. Just a very slow drifting apart, bit by bit, until I realize I'm no longer standing in your life anymore. It ends the same way it began, soft and quiet. And maybe the most painful part isn't losing you. It's that I stayed for so long in a love where only one person was still trying